Robert Charles Gleason, Jr. On January 16, 2013, a man sat down in Virginia's electric chair, smiled at the witnesses watching through the glass, winked at his spiritual advisor, and gave a thumbs up before the switch was flipped. His final words were a rambling string of inside jokes and an Irish Gaelic phrase that roughly translates to "kiss my ass." His name was Robert Gleason, Jr., and he had spent the last 2 years of his life doing everything in his power to make sure this moment would happen. He didn't fight his execution, he demanded it. And when the state of Virginia hesitated, he told them he had more inmates lined up to kill until they gave him what he wanted. It was 2007, and Gleason was running a methamphetamine operation out of Central Virginia. He was also an award-winning tattoo artist who owned a shop called Earth and Sky Tattoo Co. on Boulevard in Colonial Heights. By all outward appearances, he was a businessman, a creative. The kind of guy who signed his letters Bobby from Boston, because even after years in Virginia, he still considered himself a proud Yankee from Lowell, Massachusetts. But Gleason had a past that most of his clients never saw. Childhood abuse, armed robberies as a teenager, a cocaine and steroid habit that had been building for years. His older brother had died during a botched escape from a Massachusetts prison. Violence ran through the family like a current. On May 8, 2007, federal investigators were closing in on his meth ring, and Gleason decided that a trucker named Michael Kent Jamerson, 54 years old, knew too much. He lured Jamerson to a wooded area in Amherst County, pulled a pistol from the man's own belt, told him to get right with God, and started shooting. He pleaded guilty in 2008 and received life without parole. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. Exactly 2 years later, on May 8, 2009, Gleason killed again. This time his victim was his own cellmate at Wallens Ridge State Prison, a 63-year-old mentally impaired man named Harvey Gray Watson, Jr., who had been serving 100 years for a 1983 shotgun rampage. Gleason hogtied him, beat him, and strangled him in their shared cell. Guards did not discover the body for roughly 15 hours. And somehow, it gets worse. On July 28, 2010, while awaiting sentencing at Red Onion State Prison, Gleason reached through wire fencing between recreation cages and convinced a 26-year-old convicted carjacker named Aaron Alexander Cooper to try on what Gleason called a religious necklace. Once it was around Cooper's neck, Gleason twisted it and strangled him to death. He later told the court he had killed Cooper to make a point to the prosecutor and as a favor to another inmate. When he stood before Wise County Circuit Court on September 6, 2011, Gleason made his intentions plain. He wanted the death penalty, and he was willing to keep killing to get it. He told prosecutors he had a few more inmates lined up if they denied him. He represented himself. He waived every appeal. The court found the aggravating factors of vileness and future dangerousness beyond a reasonable doubt. Then came the letters. Wise County Commonwealth's attorney Ron Elkins revealed that Gleason had mailed him an envelope marked with the word "boom" and a message inside that read, "See you in hell." Elkins later said that with Gleason, the threat was real, and that he worried less for himself than for his family. Cooper's mother, Kim Strickland, set aside her own religious objections to capital punishment after Gleason mailed her Bible verses preaching an eye for an eye. She testified that he deserved to die and later sued the prison system, alleging that Red Onion guards had helped Gleason set up the murder. Governor Bob McDonnell reviewed clemency even though no petition had been filed. He found no compelling reason to intercede. And so on that January night in 2013, at 9:08 p.m., Robert Gleason was electrocuted at Greensville Correctional Center in Jarrett. He became the first person executed in the United States that year, and the first to die by electric chair in Virginia in nearly 3 years. He also became something else: the last person the Commonwealth of Virginia would ever execute. On March 24, 2021, Virginia abolished the death penalty entirely, and Gleason's case was cited repeatedly by both sides during the legislative debate. A 2011 caseworker report had described him as paranoid, anxious, and exhausted by prison, which led some analysts to argue that his demand to die was never defiance at all. It was a covert suicide, carried out by the state. That's not a typo, by the way. The man who killed 3 people, who taunted prosecutors and mailed threats to the families of his victims, may have been engineering his own death the entire time. But Gleason is just one name on a long list of violent offenders who have passed through the gates of Red Onion State Prison. And the next one on this list didn't just terrorize a cell block, he terrorized an entire region of the country for 3 straight weeks. Lee Boyd Malvo. In October of 2002, the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area went through something that most American cities have never experienced. For 21 consecutive days, people were being shot and killed at random while doing the most ordinary things imaginable: pumping gas, mowing a lawn, loading groceries, standing on a street corner. There was no pattern, no apparent motive, and no warning. Just a single rifle crack and then silence. By the time it was over, 10 people were dead, and 3 more were wounded. The shooters turned out to be a 41-year-old Army veteran named John Allen Muhammad and his 17-year-old companion, Lee Boyd Malvo, firing from a modified hole cut into the trunk of a blue 1990 Chevrolet Caprice. But this story doesn't start with the shootings. It starts with a boy who had no one. Malvo was born on February 18, 1985, in Kingston, Jamaica. His mother largely abandoned him, drifting in and out of his life for years. When he was around 14, he met John Allen Muhammad in Antigua. Muhammad gave him something he had never had: a father figure, a sense of purpose, and a belief system. He converted Malvo to Islam and slowly reshaped the teenager's entire identity. Malvo's defense attorney later said the boy genuinely believed Muhammad's plan to extort $10 million from the United States government would fund a utopian society for 140 homeless black children on a compound in Canada. What nobody knew at the time was that Muhammad was grooming a weapon. The killing began on October 2, 2002. Over the next 3 weeks, the pair shot 13 people across Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. The victims were people like James Martin, Prem Kumar Walekar, Sarah Ramos, and FBI analyst Linda Franklin, who was shot outside a Home Depot in Fairfax County. A 13-year-old boy was shot outside his middle school in Bowie, Maryland. He survived, but the fear that gripped the region was paralyzing. Schools went into lockdown. Gas stations hung tarps around their pumps so customers could refuel without being exposed. An entire metropolitan area of 5 million people was afraid to step outside. They were captured on October 24th at a rest stop near Myersville, Maryland, asleep in the Caprice. The rifle, a Bushmaster, was in the car. Virginia prosecutors fought to try them in the Commonwealth specifically because Virginia, unlike Maryland, still allowed the death penalty for juveniles at the time. In 2003, a Chesapeake jury convicted Malvo of capital murder in the killing of Linda Franklin. The jury rejected the death sentence and imposed life without parole. He later pleaded guilty to 6 counts of first-degree murder in Maryland and received 6 additional life sentences. Muhammad was executed by lethal injection on November 10, 2009. Malvo was sent to Red Onion State Prison and he stayed there for more than 20 years. Most of that time was spent in the prison's most restrictive housing. In March of 2020, he married a woman in a ceremony at the facility. His advisor described it as a beautiful moment. In 2011, Wise County denied his petition to legally change his name, which he had requested on the grounds that anonymity would protect him from other inmates. Then came the legal battle that nearly set him free. In 2018, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals ordered Virginia to resentence Malvo under the Supreme Court's rulings in Miller v. Alabama and Montgomery v. Louisiana, which held that mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles were unconstitutional. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which heard oral arguments in October of 2019. The case was ultimately dismissed in February 2020 after Virginia changed its law to make juvenile lifers eligible for parole after 20 years. The Virginia Parole Board denied his parole on August 30, 2022, calling him a risk to the community. Fairfax prosecutor Ray Morrow put it bluntly, saying that despite what people claimed, the legal fight was always about one thing, and that was releasing Malvo. And no, I'm not making that up. The teenager who participated in one of the most terrifying domestic shooting sprees in American history was, for a period of several years, legally closer to freedom than most people realize. In August of 2023, Malvo filed a federal civil rights lawsuit alleging that Red Onion officials had retaliated against him for filing complaints by placing him in a pod with a gang leader who had threatened his life. He was transferred to Keene Mountain Correctional Center around June of 2024. As of late 2024, Malvo is 40 years old, housed at Keene Mountain in Oakwood, Virginia, still serving multiple life sentences in both Virginia and Maryland. A resentencing in Maryland remains pending. In a 2010 letter to one of the surviving victims, Malvo wrote that he was truly sorry for the pain he had caused. Whether that apology carries any weight is something each person touched by those 21 days in October has to decide for themselves. Malvo spent 2 decades inside Red Onion, but he wasn't the only predator housed there whose crimes stretched across years and left a trail of victims that investigators struggled to connect. Jesse Leroy Matthew Jr. For nearly a decade, women were disappearing and dying in central Virginia, and nobody could figure out who was responsible. A college student vanished after a concert in 2009. A young woman was attacked outside her apartment in Fairfax in 2005. And then, in September of 2014, an 18-year-old University of Virginia sophomore walked off the downtown mall in Charlottesville and was never seen alive again. It took almost 10 years, but the DNA finally connected all 3 cases to one man. 7 years before that DNA match closed the case, Jesse Matthew was living a life that looked unremarkable on paper. Born in 1981, he grew up in Charlottesville, played football at Liberty University, and later at Christopher Newport University. He left each school within weeks of separate sexual assault allegations that never resulted in charges. He settled into working as a taxi driver and then as a patient technician at the UVA Medical Center. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. Those quiet years between the allegations and the arrests gave Matthew room to operate, and the crimes he committed during that window were staggering. On September 24, 2005, Matthew grabbed a 26-year-old woman in Fairfax as she returned from a grocery store, dragged her behind a darkened pool area, and sexually assaulted her until passers-by intervened and scared him off. DNA collected from underneath her fingernails was preserved, though at the time investigators had no suspect to match it to. On October 17, 2009, Morgan Dana Harrington, a 20-year-old Virginia Tech junior, stepped outside the John Paul Jones Arena during a Metallica concert in Charlottesville and vanished. Her skeletal remains were found 3 months later on a farm in Albemarle County. On September 13, 2014, Hannah Elizabeth Graham, an 18-year-old UVA sophomore, was last captured on surveillance footage walking alongside a man on the Charlottesville downtown mall at around 1:20 in the morning. Her remains were found 5 weeks later on Old Lynchburg Road in southern Albemarle County, roughly 5 miles from where Harrington had been discovered. The forensic link between all 3 cases was DNA. The sample from the 2005 Fairfax assault matched biological evidence recovered in connection with both Harrington and Graham. When Matthew was identified as the suspect, the scope of what he had done came into focus all at once. In June of 2015, Matthew entered an Alford plea in Fairfax to attempted capital murder, abduction with intent to defile, and sexual assault in the 2005 case. The Commonwealth's attorney confirmed the DNA match was overwhelming. On March 2, 2016, in Albemarle County Circuit Court before Judge Cheryl Higgins, Matthew pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of abduction with intent to defile for the killings of Graham and Harrington. The plea spared him a capital murder trial. He waived all rights to appeal, parole, and geriatric release. He received 3 life sentences for the Fairfax case and 4 consecutive life sentences for the Albemarle cases. 7 life terms in total. Hannah Graham's father addressed the court and said that Matthew's evil had deprived the world of a great talent, but that Hannah's enduring gift was that she enabled this man to be apprehended and convicted. He said she did change the world, but at a terrible price. Morgan Harrington's mother said the finality achieved that day would allow their family to redirect energy into healing, and added that it takes a village to raise a child, and she knew it takes one to bury a child. Her father described living in a world that had gone gray, flat, and devoid of joy. Prosecutors called Matthew a modern-day Jekyll and Hyde. Albemarle Commonwealth's attorney Robert Traxey acknowledged that no outcome would ever produce closure, but said the agreement promoted resolution. Police also investigated Matthew for possible connections to several other unsolved cases, including the disappearance of Samantha Clark in Orange County in 2010, the disappearance of Cassandra Morton in Lynchburg in 2009, and the double murder of Heidi Childs and David Metzler near Blacksburg in 2009. None of those investigations resulted in additional charges. Jesse Matthew is currently serving 7 life sentences with no possibility of release of any kind. He will die in prison. But not every inmate at Red Onion is there for the crimes a court convicted them of. Some are there because of what they did and said and organized after they arrived. And what comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense to a lot of people. Because the man at the center of it is simultaneously one of the most celebrated prisoners in the country and one of the most controversial. Kevin Rashid Johnson. How does someone go from a life sentence for murder to having their artwork collected by museums, their essays published in The Guardian, and their names spoken alongside some of the most famous political prisoners in American history? That is the question at the center of Kevin Johnson's story, and the answer depends almost entirely on who you ask. Johnson was born on October 3, 1971, in Richmond, Virginia. His parents separated when he was an infant. His father took custody, but Johnson was raised primarily by his paternal grandmother. By his own account, his father disciplined him with violence, and he was cycling through disciplinary institutions by his teenage years. In 1990, at roughly 18 years old, Johnson was convicted of murder in Virginia and sentenced to life in prison. He has maintained for decades that the conviction was based on misidentification by a police informant. Supporters within the Jericho movement and other prisoner advocacy organizations have echoed that claim. But a critical detail has to be stated plainly here. Despite extensive searching across court records, news archives, and public databases, the victim's name, the exact date of the crime, the city or county where it occurred, and the trial court's case citation are not available in any indexed open-source material. Johnson's own biographical writings and those of his supporters focus almost entirely on his innocence claim and his activism, and they omit the underlying facts of the killing itself. That gap matters, and it should be noted. What is documented in detail is what Johnson has done in the decades since. He has spent roughly 18 years in solitary confinement across multiple states. From 1995 to 2012, he was held at Wallens Ridge and Red Onion State Prisons in Virginia. In 2005, he co-founded the new African Black Panther Party prison chapter. In 2020, he split from that organization to form the Revolutionary Intercommunal Black Panther Party. He has authored 2 books, Defying the Tomb in 2010 and Panther Vision in 2015. His drawings, including the unofficial logo for the 2011 California prison hunger strikes, have been published in academic journals and displayed in collections internationally. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Not about the solitary confinement, at least, until the lawsuits started. Beginning in February of 2012, the Virginia Department of Corrections began transferring Johnson through an interstate compact arrangement that moved him from Virginia to Oregon, then Texas, then Florida, Indiana, Ohio, and eventually back to Virginia. Johnson and his legal team have described this as retaliation for his writing and organizing. In Texas, at the Clements Unit near Amarillo, Johnson alleged that on December 21, 2016, he was pepper-sprayed in his cell while handcuffed and had his property seized at the direction of a facility captain. Johnson became a class member in Thorpe v. Virginia Department of Corrections, an ACLU Virginia class action challenging the state's solitary confinement practices. On June 15, 2021, the court ruled the program unconstitutional. Then came the hunger strike. On December 26, 2023, a group of incarcerated men at Red Onion began refusing food to protest the continued use of solitary confinement, despite a 2023 General Assembly bill. Johnson refused food for 71 days. The Virginia Department of Corrections sought a court order to force-feed him. The court ruled he was competent to make his own decisions and could continue. He was moved to a medical unit, then transferred to VCU Medical Center for chest pains and severe dehydration. His legal team filed an emergency motion citing retaliation in February of 2024. He ended the strike in March in exchange for a transfer to Greensville Correctional Center. But by November of 2024, he had been moved back into maximum security custody. Johnson was also diagnosed with prostate cancer. He told Prison Radio that blood tests in early October of 2021 had shown a high likelihood of cancer, but that Virginia prison officials did nothing for over 6 months. Noel Hanrahan of Prison Radio has compared Johnson's impact to that of a 21st-century George Jackson. His signature sign-off on every letter and statement is the same 5 words: dare to struggle, dare to win. As of late 2024, Kevin Johnson is 53 years old, serving a life sentence in Virginia's correction system, and reported to be back in the state's western region maximum security facilities. His supporters call him a political prisoner. The state of Virginia calls him a convicted murderer. The facts of the original crime remain, for now, locked in paper records that have never been digitized. If you're enjoying this video and you're not subscribed yet, consider hitting that button. It helps grow this channel more than you'd think, and there are more cases to come. Joaquin Shadow Rams, Sr. Between 2003 and 2012, 3 people close to a man named Joaquin Shadow Rams ended up dead. His ex-girlfriend was found shot in the head in her apartment. His mother was found asphyxiated in her home, a death initially ruled a suicide. And then his 15-month-old son died during a supervised visit while in his care. After each death, Rams filed life insurance claims, and after each claim, he collected. The question investigators eventually had to answer was whether one man could really be that unlucky, or whether something far worse was going on. Nobody was paying attention to Joaquin Shadow Rams before the pattern emerged. Born John Anthony Ramirez in 1972 in New York, he legally changed his name in 2002 and eventually settled in Manassas, Virginia, with his mother, Alma Collins. He ran an online business called Adults Online that dealt in nude modeling. He had relationships. He fathered children. On the surface, it was a life that did not invite scrutiny. But his older half-brother Joseph Velez would later tell a very different story. Velez said the violence started when Rams was 3 years old, when he struck Velez on the head with a hammer while pretending to ask for a kiss. Whether or not that detail is symbolic, it is the earliest recorded sign that something was wrong. In 2003, Rams's ex-girlfriend, Sean Katrina Mason, 22, was found shot in the head inside her Manassas apartment. Rams told police he had broken in because he could not reach her. He then attempted to collect on a $143,000 employer life insurance policy. Police considered him the prime suspect, but the case did not result in charges at the time. In 2008, Rams's mother, Alma Collins, was found dead in Bristow, Virginia, from asphyxiation. The death was initially ruled a suicide. Rams collected approximately $162,000 in life insurance. Then, on October 20th, 2012, 15-month-old Prince McLeod Rams died while in his father's care during the 4th unsupervised visit under a court-ordered visitation arrangement in Manassas. Rams claimed the boy had suffered a fever-induced seizure and that he had been trying to revive him. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy ruled the cause of death as drowning, but her supervisor, Virginia Chief Medical Examiner William Gormley, did something he had never done before in his career. He overruled her and changed the official cause of death to undetermined. That decision became a centerpiece of the defense. What prosecutors uncovered next was the motive. Within months of Prince's birth, Rams had purchased 3 separate life insurance policies on the infant worth a combined total of more than $524,000. His Bristow home was in foreclosure. A $50,000 line of credit had been exhausted. He was drowning in debt, and the only asset he had that could generate that kind of money was a baby. A bench trial began in April of 2017 in Prince William County Circuit Court, before Fairfax County Circuit Judge Randy the Bellows, who had been assigned from Fairfax. Rams had waived his right to a jury in exchange for prosecutors dropping the death penalty. Prosecutors Paul B. Ebert and James A. Willett built a circumstantial case brick by brick. 4 jailhouse informants testified. Housemates Roger and Sue Justice described Rams's behavior that day, saying he had briefly splashed water on the boy rather than submerging him, which prosecutors argued left a narrow window of time during which Rams acted alone with Prince. Even Rams's older son, who was 13 at the time, took the stand and told the court that his father had been acting like Prince was dying at a point when the infant showed no obvious distress. On April 13, 2017, after reading a 62-page opinion aloud for more than 2 hours, Judge Bellows found Rams guilty of capital murder. The judge stated that Prince did not die of natural causes, whether from a febrile seizure or any other natural process or disease. At sentencing in August, Bellows called the murder cold, calculating and callous in its nature, and shattering in its impact. The sentence was life in prison without parole. Prince's mother, Hera McLeod, told reporters that either Rams was the most unlucky person on the planet, or he was a killer. After the verdict, she said she was relieved because he was never getting out. His half-brother Velez said his heart was dancing, that they finally got some justice. The conviction was affirmed by Chief Judge Marla Graf Decker in the Virginia Court of Appeals in February of 2019. Rams was also indicted in 2013 for the 2003 murder of Sean Mason, though that charge was later dismissed. Joaquin Shadow Rams is currently serving life without parole in the Virginia Department of Corrections. For a while after that case, things in the region went quiet. That didn't last, because the next person on this list didn't target people he knew. He targeted strangers in their own homes, in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Virginia, and he did it over the span of more than a decade before anyone connected the killings. Charles Severance. In 1996, a man dressed in a black cloak and sunglasses showed up to a mayoral forum in Alexandria, Virginia, picked up an American flag from the stage, and pointed the spiked finial directly at Congressman Jim Moran before fleeing the room. His name was Charles Severance, and he was running for mayor. He ran again in 2000. He also ran for Congress in the 8th District. He never came close to winning any of those races. To most people in Alexandria, he was a fringe character, someone who showed up, caused a scene, and disappeared. At least that's what everyone thought. What nobody connected at the time was that Severance's anger toward Alexandria had been metastasizing into something far more dangerous. He had lost a bitter custody fight over his son Levite in the city's courts, and according to prosecutors, that loss became the engine for a years-long killing spree targeting prominent Alexandria residents in their own homes. On December 5, 2003, Nancy Dunning, 56, a real estate agent and the wife of then Alexandria Sheriff James Dunning, was shot inside her home. 10 years passed with no arrest. On November 11, 2013, Ronald Kirby, a regionally well-known transportation planner, was shot in his home. Less than 3 months later, on February 6, 2014, Ruth Ann Lodato, a music teacher whose brother and father were both Alexandria judges, was shot and killed at her front door. Her mother's caregiver, a woman named Dorcas Franco, was wounded but survived. 3 home intrusion shootings across more than a decade, all in upscale Alexandria neighborhoods, all committed with the same type of ammunition. Deputy Commonwealth's attorney David Lord told the jury that all 3 victims were felled with .22 caliber long rifle, plain lead, Remington brand ammunition. Prosecutors called that combination a forensic signature, and the link to Severance came from his own writing. His journals and personal papers were filled with entries glorifying that exact ammunition, calling it sweet music and very, very effective. He wrote admiringly about the North American Arms mini revolver, a gun he owned and had also persuaded a girlfriend to purchase. In one passage that prosecutors read to the jury, Severance had written about introducing murder into a safe and secure neighborhood and doing it again and again and again. Another entry referenced receiving no satisfaction after a revenge killing. And somehow, it gets worse. A defense psychologist named William Steiskal diagnosed Severance with schizotypal personality disorder with paranoid features. The defense, led by attorneys Joseph King and Megan Thomas, did not pursue an insanity plea. Before his arrest, Severance had actually attempted to claim asylum at the Russian embassy. He was ultimately found and arrested in West Virginia. The trial was moved to Fairfax County due to pretrial publicity and began in October of 2015. Witness Dorcas Franco, the caregiver who survived the Lodato shooting, was ordered by the judge to look directly at Severance in the courtroom. She told the jury that he looked like the guy and that his eyes told her something. Defense attorneys argued that everyone was suspicious of the middle-aged man with no place to call home, but the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. On November 2, 2015, the jury convicted Severance on all 10 counts, including 2 counts of capital murder for the killings of Kirby and Lodato. He was formally sentenced on January 22, 2016, to 3 life sentences plus 48 years and $400,000 in fines. During sentencing, Severance shouted the word sadism twice into a microphone and quoted a 16th-century article of religion from the Church of England's Book of Common Prayer. Commonwealth's attorney Brian Porter told the courtroom that the reign of the Alexandria assassin was over. The prosecutor at sentencing called Severance a cold-blooded killer and said the jury had delivered justice to a monster. Ron Kirby's widow, Ann Haynes, said the last thing her husband ever told her was to call him when she got lost, and that she had been truly lost without him ever since. Nancy Dunning's daughter, Liz, said her family had long ago stopped believing this day would come, and thanked the jury. Defense attorneys maintained that the case was more complicated than just an evil man. The convictions were unanimously upheld by a 3-judge panel of the Court of Appeals of Virginia in May of 2017. Severance remains in Virginia DOC custody, serving life without parole. He never named any of his 3 victims in his own writings. His defense attorneys leaned hard on that fact. Among the spectators at the trial was former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell, who had been a high school friend of Ruth Ann Lodato's husband. Up to this point, every case on this list involved a killer acting alone, or at least a killer whose violence followed some internal logic, whether it was money, rage, or ideology. The next case is different. It was sudden. It was public. And it happened on a bus full of college students returning from a class trip. Christopher Darnell Jones, Jr. On the evening of November 13, 2022, a charter bus pulled into the Culbreth Garage parking deck on the University of Virginia's central grounds. The students on board were returning from a field trip to Washington, D.C., where a drama class led by Professor Teresa Davis had gone to see a play. Some of them were asleep. Some were gathering their things. Then, around 10:16 p.m., one of the passengers opened fire. If you had asked anyone at UVA about Christopher Jones before that night, they would have told you he was quiet, maybe troubled. Certainly not someone who registered as a serious threat, even though there had been warnings. Jones was born around 1999 in Petersburg, Virginia. He described his father leaving when he was 5 as one of the most traumatic things that had ever happened to him. Character witnesses who testified at his sentencing said both parents had modeled violence in the home. Despite that, Jones earned the Dr. Porcher L. Taylor Jr. Scholastic Award in 2018 and enrolled at UVA, briefly joining the football team as a walk-on that same year. He never appeared in a game. In 2021, he was convicted of a concealed weapons misdemeanor and received a 12-month suspended sentence. In the fall of 2022, UVA's threat assessment team received tips that Jones owned a gun. He refused to cooperate with the inquiry. The university never opened a disciplinary process. That was a warning sign. Jones ignored it. And so did UVA. What followed on that November night was the worst act of violence in Albemarle County history. Jones killed 3 of his former teammates: Lavelle Davis Jr., a wide receiver, Deshaun Perry, a linebacker, and Devin Chandler, who prosecutors said was asleep when he was shot. 2 more students were wounded. Running back Mike Hollins survived after multiple surgeries and returned to football the following season. A student named Marley Morgan was released the next day, but carried lasting trauma. Jones fled the scene. Body camera footage from a UVA officer who encountered him 5 minutes later shows Jones lifting his shirt and denying any knowledge of what had happened. He was arrested roughly 12 hours later in Henrico County, about 77 miles away. UVA canceled its remaining football game against Coastal Carolina, and ultimately the Virginia Tech season finale. On November 20th, 2024, in Albemarle County Circuit Court, before Judge Cheryl Higgins, Jones pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of aggravated malicious wounding, and 5 counts of use of a firearm in commission of a felony. The plea reduced his exposure from aggravated first-degree murder, making him eligible for geriatric parole at age 60. The sentencing hearing lasted 5 days in November of 2025. Defense psychologist Dr. Jeffrey Aaron testified that Jones had been in an on-and-off sexual relationship with a female classmate who was on the bus, and that on the day of the shooting, he had become paranoid and fixated on the idea that she was setting him up. Aaron said Jones had described hearing a voice repeating, "Do it, don't do it," over and over. Prosecutor Richard Farley called it the worst crime in Albemarle history. Assistant Commonwealth's attorney Susan Baumgartner said the mercy was in the plea. Albemarle Commonwealth's attorney Jim Hingley called the acts unfathomable acts of harm. Professor Teresa Davis testified that what she witnessed that night was unrecognizable to her, calling it a level of evil she had never seen. On November 21st, 2025, Judge Higgins imposed 5 life sentences plus 23 years, the maximum possible. She described the killing of Lavelle Davis Jr. as execution style and said the other 2 victims could not have been more vulnerable. She specifically rejected the bullying defense, citing a text Jones sent before the shooting in which he said he would either go to hell or spend 100+ years in jail, as proof that he understood exactly what he was doing. Jones addressed the court for 15 minutes, sobbing, and said he was sorry, that he had caused so much pain, that he didn't know their sons, and that he wished he did. Several family members walked out as he spoke. Mike Hollins said afterward that there was a small bit of peace in knowing the man who committed those crimes would never hurt anyone else. His mother, Brenda Hollins, said it was a life sentence for all of them. Devin Chandler's mother addressed her son directly in court, calling him baby boy. Jones had twice tried to buy a gun and failed a background check on one attempt. He succeeded in purchasing a handgun and a rifle in separate transactions in the months before the shooting. UVA had been alerted to his possession of a firearm by a third party and still never opened a disciplinary case. Christopher Darnell Jones Jr. was sentenced at age 26 to 5 life sentences plus 23 years. He has entered long-term Virginia DOC custody and will be eligible for geriatric parole consideration at age 60. But the last case on this list is the one that took the longest to solve, left the most wreckage behind, and managed to destroy the life of an innocent man before the real killer was ever found. Jorge Avila Torres. On Mother's Day 2005, 2 young girls went out to play in Beulah Park in Zion, Illinois. Their names were Laura Hobbs, 8 years old, and Crystal Tobias, 9. By the end of that day, both children had been found dead in the park. What investigators uncovered at the scene was staggering in its scope. The evidence was consistent with a violent and predatory assault, described in court filings as deliberate and premeditated. Within 24 hours, police had a suspect in custody. Laura's own father, Jerry Hobbs, was arrested after a grueling 24-hour interrogation. He spent the next 5 years in jail for a crime he did not commit. 5 years of his life, gone, while the real killer walked free and went on to harm more people. The real killer was 16 years old at the time. He was a friend of one of the victim's half-brothers, and his name was Jorge Avila Torres. Torres's DNA would eventually match evidence recovered from the Beulah Park crime scene, but that match did not come until 2010, and only because Torres had committed more crimes in the years between. His blood and his pattern of violence left a trail that connected 3 states and spanned nearly a decade. Torres was born on August 18, 1988, in Zion, Illinois, to Mexican immigrant parents. His father worked in a cardboard factory, and his mother was a homemaker. He was close to his older sister, Sarah. He was expelled from high school in 2005 for marijuana possession. Shortly after the Beulah Park killings, he joined the United States Marine Corps and rose to the rank of corporal, stationed at Joint Base Myer-Henderson Hall in Arlington, Virginia. If Torres had stopped here, this would be a very different story, but he didn't stop. On July 13, 2009, Navy Petty Officer Second Class Amanda Jean Snell, a 20-year-old naval military intelligence specialist, was found dead inside a wall locker at the base. She had been bound while she slept, strangled with a laptop power cord, and her body had been concealed inside the locker for 2 days before it was discovered. In February of 2010, Torres attacked 2 women in an apartment in the Ballston neighborhood of Arlington. He bound them with electrical cords, abducted one of them, repeatedly assaulted her while covering her face with packing tape, choked her, and left her for dead near a highway in Prince William County. She survived and reported the crime. That surviving victim led investigators to Torres. Once in custody, he was housed with a cooperating federal inmate named Osama El-Attari, a former restaurateur who had been convicted of defrauding banks of $53 million. El-Attari wore a wire. On tape, Torres confessed to 3 murders. His DNA was then matched to the 2005 Beulah Park crime scene, and Jerry Hobbs was finally exonerated after 5 years behind bars for a crime he never committed. The legal proceedings unfolded across 3 jurisdictions. In December of 2010, Torres was convicted in Arlington County on the Virginia attacks and sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences, plus 168 years. He was sent to Red Onion State Prison. In April of 2014, a federal jury in the Eastern District of Virginia found Torres guilty of capital murder for Amanda Snell's killing. He instructed his attorneys not to contest the death penalty phase. Judge Liam O'Grady imposed the federal death sentence, making Torres the first person sentenced to death at the federal courthouse in Alexandria since 2007. In September of 2018, in Lake County, Illinois, Circuit Court before Judge Daniel Shaines, Torres pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Laura Hobbs and Crystal Tobias. He received 100 years, 50 per victim. The plea included a condition that he be transferred out of Red Onion. His defense attorney, Jed Stone, called Red Onion an evil, racist facility. Judge Shaines told Torres directly that he was a serial killer, and that if there was even a spark of goodness in him, it was so far out of reach that it was unattainable. He called the crimes cruel, cold-blooded, and devoid of mercy. Crystal Tobias's mother, Marina, said she was glad it was over, and that the outcome ensured he would never do anything like that to anyone else. Lake County State's Attorney Mike Nerheim called it a horrific double homicide of two beautiful young girls taken on a Mother's Day. The Fourth Circuit affirmed his federal conviction and death sentence in July of 2019. The Supreme Court denied review in September of 2020. Then, on December 23, 2024, President Joe Biden commuted Torres's federal death sentence to life without parole as part of a sweeping executive action that spared 37 of 40 federal death row inmates. The three excluded from the commutation were Dylan Roof, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, and Robert Bowers. The cooperating inmate Elatari, who had worn the wire that produced Torres's confession, was murdered during a robbery in Maryland in February of 2014 before he could testify in the Illinois case. The defense argued his earlier federal testimony should be excluded. Jerry Hobbs received $7,750,000 in settlements from multiple Illinois jurisdictions for his wrongful prosecution. $4 million from Waukegan, $2 million from Zion, $1.4 million from Vernon Hills, $250,000 from Lake County, and $100,000 from the state of Illinois. None of the entities admitted wrongdoing. The Lake County case prompted reforms after it was revealed that 5 men had served a combined 80 years in prison, despite DNA evidence of innocence under the previous state's attorney. Jorge Avila Torres continues to serve 5 Virginia life sentences, plus 168 years, 100 years from Illinois, and a federal life without parole term. Release is a mathematical impossibility. If you've made it this far, thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.